next part, and we're gonna pick up where we left off in the last video. I know in the last video I said I was gonna start from the top of this like little section and then continue forward, but I got kind of lost toward the end of the video, and I said I would do like more research, and I actually ended up doing that. And I just kind of want to give like a brief little kind of like recap of what like we're kind of putting together. So in one of these other kings lists that we were looking at a couple of videos ago, we saw that we have first like these shepherd kings that came into Egypt and ruled, and then they kind of diminished and dwindled after the like kind of generations go by. And then after that, you get some of the native rulers of Egypt coming in and ruling, and up eventually until that point comes like Amenophis, this king, who was said to like participate in the Trojan War, but I kind of like compared that with like the AI, and it was saying that like Amenophis was like 200 years before the best dating for the Trojan War, and that it would have been like I think during not even Amenhotep the Fourth's ruling, which is Akhenaten. That was still like 100 or 200 years prior to the Trojan War. Now, keep in mind that's probably like the latest account or maybe layer of the Trojan War, and that could always be up to like misinterpretation with the dating. But they go off basically based on like what accounts and whatnot. I don't know what in particular, but that would require a lot of research to kind of dig into that. But aside from that, what I kind of made like a little chronology, and so you have the shepherd kings, and then what you have is then the which are the Hyksos, and then you have the Exodus, and then the Trojan War. So you have like the sequence of events that whatever time period and whoever was ruling, it's like unsure of what time. It 100% for sure goes in that sequence. Even though there's like an offsetting with some of the dating that this book would say, Amenophis was part of the Trojan War and whatnot, even though Amenophis was said to be 200 years before that. What is lining up is the Hyksos, then the Exodus, and then the Trojan War. Now, I don't really know too many details about the Trojan War, except other than like I don't really know the participants who were, I guess like the Hittites and like the Ionian Greeks and stuff like that. It was just like stuff that kind of like was before classical Greece. So, but I know that war is like really relevant, especially in Greek literature and like some of these accounts later on. So, but what this book was saying, essentially, or not this book, excuse me, this section. This was like a little excerpt from Amenophis and like his ruling and what happened during his ruling. So to sum up what was going on in the last video, because I kind of got lost and I kind of got sidetracked with looking at like the city of Avaris and getting confused with everything. But like I said, I was doing some research and I kind of like formulated some ideas while I was kind of looking at this again. And so Amenophis the king wanted to like what is said in this book to behold the gods, and now that could be left up to interpretation what that means, but essentially he went to like a priest, and the priest kind of gave him like a fortune, like, hey, if you want to behold the gods, you got to get rid of like these lepers or these people who are like said to be like unclean. However that gets interpreted to us today, I don't really know exactly what that means, but I don't know. But what I do know is that they did that, but the priest also had another vision where that those who it's almost like assumed that they were gonna be that like they're like the descendants of the Hyksos, and they were like unwanted Egyptian citizens or whatever, and the shepherd kings probably didn't adhere to like the religion of the Egyptians, so they just kind of like hey, screw you guys, just get out of here, we'll send you to the mines forever. So the priest told them to like go send all these like unclean peoples to the mines over there where we talked about the last video, and like that area in the Nile, or not the Nile, the Sinai, and Avaris. But that priest also had another vision, and the other vision said that those people that he sent to those mines would revolt and then take over Egypt for 13 years. And I guess he wrote that down and then killed himself. And then that stressed out Amenophis, so then he started like kind of like making like I guess countermeasures for all that. But I guess not so much. And then like towards like the end of the video that we were looking at in the last video, where we kind of saw that these people were kind of like, you know, those unclean people started rising, took a capital in Avaris, and you know they were doing everything the opposite of the Egyptians that they were doing. You know what I mean? Like not worshiping their gods, and then also like slaying all the animals that they considered sacred. And then they started like kind of like fortifying the city of Avaris, and then from there they sent ambassadors to Jerusalem, and I guess what's saying right here is to the shepherds that had been expelled by Thutmose, which was probably the Hyksos that got expelled and whatnot. But they sent ambassadors to Jerusalem to go help out, and then so from there, you know, they kind of built up this kind of like army, and then they're making deals with these people, and then I think we left off maybe right here. So yeah, so like I said, they were getting ambassadors to Jerusalem, and then kind of like making deals and saying like, hey, we need help taking over this Egyptian thing. You know, it'll be really easy if you give us some support, and you know they'll do whatever contribution. So I think we left off like kind of in this area. So I'm just gonna read from the top right here. The greatest joy, and quickly mustered to the number of 200,000 men, came up to Avaris. So that's like all the people that they gathered together to go take on the Egyptians. Now Amenophis, the king of Egypt, when he was informed of their invasion, was in great consternation, remembering the prophecy of Amenophis, the son of Papis, who that guy is, that's the priest we mentioned from just right now. And he assembled the armies of the Egyptians, and having consulted with the leaders, he commanded the sacred animals to be brought to him, especially those which were held in more particular veneration in the temples. And he forthwith charged the priests to conceal the images of their gods with utmost care. Moreover, he placed his son Sethos, who was also called Ramesses for the father Ramses, being then but 5 years old, under the protection of a faithful adherent, and marched with the rest of the Egyptians, being 300,000 warriors, against the enemy who advanced to meet him, but he did not attack them, thinking it would be to wage war against the gods, but returned, and came again to Memphis, where he took Apis and the other sacred animals he had sent for, and retreated immediately into Ethiopia together with all his army and all the multitude of the Egyptians. What the heck? So they were in Lower Egypt, basically, kind of ruling from all over there, and he just left the area completely. They just all went to Upper Egypt and didn't go to war. Huh. That's interesting. The Apis bull. They venerated the bull a lot. What's interesting too is that they worship the bull a lot in India too. It's like this whole bull worship. I don't know, just something to point out and take interest. But that's interesting because all this era is like golden calf. You know what I mean? Like what is it, like the whole like thing I was saying a couple of videos with the astrology where Moses is like he's like a, in the Bible he's like a symbol of like the astrological age of Taurus moving to the age of the Ram, and then later on you get the age of the Ram to the age of Pisces. But aside from that, just I don't know if this is like kind of symbology that you can connect, but to me it looks like it's like connected in that sort of sense, where it's like I don't know if this is purely symbolical, but just looking at it is just kind of, you know, interesting to point that out. You know what I mean? Like the ape is bold, they're retreating. It's this whole like new era taking over. Symbologically looking at this whole statement, but I mean from a literal sense, I mean just take it as how it is. Okay, so yeah, they leave and retreat to Ethiopia, for the king of Ethiopia was under obligations to him. He was therefore kindly received by the king of Ethiopia, who took care of all the multitude that was with him, while the country supplied what was necessary for their subsistence. He also allotted them to him cities and villages during his exile, which was to continue from its beginning during the predestined 13 years. Moreover, he pitched a camp for an Ethiopian army upon the borders of Egypt as a protection to King Amenophis. In the meantime, while such was the state of things in Ethiopia, the people of Jerusalem, who had come down with the unclean of the Egyptians, treated the inhabitants with such barbarity that those who witnessed their impieties believed that their joint sway was more I can't pronounce that word, it's like all jumbled for me, than that which the shepherds had formerly exercised alone. For they not only set fire to the cities and villages, but committed every kind of sacrilege, and destroyed the images of the gods, and roasted and fed upon those sacred animals that were worshipped. And having compelled the priests and prophets to kill and sacrifice them, they cast them naked out of the country. It is said also that the priest who ordained their polity and laws was by birth of Heliopolis, and his name Osarphus, from Osiris the god of Heliopolis. But that when he went over to these people, his name was changed, and he was called Moses. Well, this is a different, like, kind of like outlook on it, though. This is saying that, like, Moses went from Jerusalem to Egypt, which is like the complete opposite of the Exodus. So I don't know what this is really saying, to be honest. I do know, like, we're looking at another video that this might not be connected to like the name Moses, but I don't know. It's looking like it's connecting them, but was by birth of Heliopolis. Okay, so yeah, this was Sarphus. This person was earlier in this book, or in the text here in the excerpt, that he was one of the people. Oh, wait a minute. So maybe this was like right before the Exodus. What the heck? It's like right before the Exodus, they kind of just like sacked Egypt completely, but then they leave. But this whole story of them being unclean and like over in Egypt, and then being slaves, and then them like coming to power. But like in the Old Testament, it doesn't say anything about like Moses going back to Egypt and like kind of doing all this stuff. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, but it's interesting. The Exodus kind of like takes it from, unless I haven't looked at all of it, the Exodus, but wow, no, that's interesting. I think this might be a little bit of a stretch though, because it's saying that like Amenophis and Moses were like during the same time period, but like I just, well, you know what? I don't know. I really don't know. Because you have Thutmose, which is like them kicking out the shepherd kings, and then you have, you know, this whole like kind of like period of like native Egyptian ruling, and then you have like and then you have like the Exodus, and then you have like, you know, the Trojan War. But aside from like the Trojan War, huh? I mean, this could have been completely omitted from the Old Testament, from my understanding. But I can't really say for sure, honestly. But it's really interesting to note that like this kind of does line up. This kind of really does line up with the Old Testament, I'll be honest with you. It's just kind of like in a slightly different way. Wow. Of the shepherds and Israelites. Excuse me. Manetho again says, after this Amenophis returned from Ethiopia with a great force, and Ramses also, his son, with other forces, encountering the shepherds and unclean people, they defeated them and slew multitudes of them, and pursued them to the bounds of Syria. Okay, hold on. Again, like that type of stuff is like completely omitted from the Old Testament, or just like it's kind of like a different spin or take or perspective. I'm assuming it's a different perspective. You know what I mean? Like everyone's gonna have their story, and that's just one side of the story. You know. You know, like they say that like the Exodus was like a peaceful, like, you know, like kind of a, what is it, like a promise. You know, it's like a peaceful like exodus out of the Egyptian country from enslavement. But this kind of takes a whole different perspective of the idea, like almost like a realistic perspective of it. Honestly, really interesting. Okay, so this is Egyptian fragments of the Exodus from Sharamon. After him, Manetho, I wish to examine Sharamon, who professes to have composed a history of Egypt. He gives the same name, as does Manetho to the king Amenophis and his son Ramses, and says as follows. Isis appeared to Amenophis in his dreams, rebuking him that her temple should have been overthrown in war, upon which Phragments, the sacred scribe, told him that if he would clear Egypt of all polluted persons, he would be delivered from these terrors. He therefore collected 250,000 unclean persons and drove them out. Their leaders were two scribes called Moses and Josephus, the latter of whom was a sacred scribe, but their Egyptian names were that of Moses, Tisithen, and that of Josephus, Petesif. They bent their ways toward Pelusium, where they met with 380,000 men left there by Amenophis, whom he would not suffer to come into Egypt. I don't really know what that's saying, but I guess what it is kind of saying here is that it's already assumed that Amenophis like abandoned Egypt. So there's this like abandonment of like Lower Egypt and like pretty much all of Egypt into like Ethiopia by the Egyptian bloodlines. It's so like, what? Now, even if you were to consider this as like divine intervention, meaning that like, you know, if these gods really wanted this to happen, like, why? Why such a weird envision, and what's going on with this? Yeah, see, like, they just kind of invaded Egypt. With these, they made a treaty and invaded Egypt, but Amenophis waited not to oppose their incursion, but fled into Ethiopia, leaving his wife pregnant. And she concealed herself in a cavern, where she brought forth a child and named him Messenes, who, when he arrived at manhood, drove out the Jews into Syria, being brought about 200,000, and recalled his father Amenophis from Ethiopia. Yeah, see, like I said, it's just like another take on the whole story of it. But the Old Testament just likes to say it's just a peaceful exodus of the sort. Ooh. Interesting. It's like you have like one side that's like a little fantasy fairy tale, and then this one's just like, yeah, this is what happened. Okay, so this one's of the Exodus from Diodorus Siculus. There having arisen in former days a pestiferous disease in Egypt, the multitude attributed the cause of the evil to the deity, for a great concourse of foreigners of every nation then dwelt in Egypt, who were addicted to strange rites in their worship and sacrifices, so that in consequence the due honors of the gods fell into disuse. When the native inhabitants of the land interfered that unless they removed them there would never be an end of their distress, they immediately therefore expelled these foreigners, the most illustrious and able of whom passed over in a body, as some say, into Greece and other places under the conduct of celebrated leaders, of whom were most renowned were Danaeus and Cadmus. But a large body of the people went forth into the country which is now called Judea, situated not far distant from Egypt, being altogether desert in those times. Okay, that's important to know that all this stuff was already a desert. That's actually key information. The leader of this colony was Moses, a man very remarkable for his great wisdom and valor. When he had taken possession of the land, among other cities, he founded that which is called Jerusalem, which is now the most celebrated. Okay, so this by multiple authors, they're pointing out that Moses founded Jerusalem. So I guess it's just like something to kind of put in your deck for now. So I'm gonna read this little footer. NB. The rest of the fragment gives an account of the Jewish polity, laws, etc. It was the beginning of Diodorus' history of the Jewish war, and is preserved by Photius. Excuse me. Of the exodus of the Jews from Lysimachus, he says that in the reign of Boshoris, king of Egypt, the Jewish people, being infected with leprosy, scurvy, and sundry other diseases, took shelter in the temples where they begged for food, and that in consequence of the vast number of persons who were seized with the complaint, there became a scarcity in Egypt. Upon this, Boshoris, the king of the Egyptians, sent persons to inquire the oracle of Ammon respecting the sterility, and the god directed him to cleanse the temples of all polluted and impious men, and cast them out into the desert, but to drown those that were affected with the leprosy and scurvy, inasmuch as their existence was displeasing to the sun, then to purify the temples, upon which the land would recover its fertility. When Boshoris had received the oracle, he assembled the priests and attendants of the altars, and commanded them to gather together all the unclean persons and deliver them over to the soldiers to lead them forth into the desert, but to wrap the lepers in sheets of lead and cast them into the sea. After they had drowned those afflicted with leprosy and scurvy, they collected the rest and left them to perish in the desert. But they took counsel among themselves. And when night came, one lightened up fires and torches to defend themselves, and fastened all the next night to propitiate the gods to save them. Upon the following day, a certain man called Moses counseled them to preserve in following one direct way till they should arrive at habitable places, and enjoin them to hold on no friendly communication with men, neither to follow those things which men esteemed good, but such as were considered evil, and to overthrow the temples and altars of the gods as often as they should happen with them. When they had assented to their proposals, they continued their journey through the desert, acting upon those rules, and after severe hardships they at length arrived in a habitable country, where, having inflicted every kind of injury upon the inhabitants, plundering, burning the temples, they came at length to land which is now called Judea, a founded city, and settled there. This city was named Hyrosila from their disposition, but in after times they acquired strength to obliterate the reproach. They changed its name and called it the city Hierosolima, and themselves Hierosolimites. So I think okay, so this word is like a root word for the word like Jude, or like Jeru, or that moon god I was talking about, right? Yera, but it's like Yer, and that's where that word Jerusalem comes from. But it's Hierosolima, and then they're Hierosolimites. But see, this is where it, like, this really, really interests me, because we just read, right, about this whole like reason for leprosy, and that there was somewhere I was looking at like leprosy and like what it is, and it's like it's said to be a curse from like the sun. And I know this book points that out, you know what I mean? Like it was just unpleasing to the sun. Now whether that was meaning like the sun god or whatever, it really doesn't paint a good picture ultimately to what's going on. It's more like just symbology, but it's just it's really like interesting, because like I'm seeing like I said, the Apis bull, right? That type of like stuff is like symbology in the Old Testament, where they're talking about like slaying the golden calf and like getting rid of it, and like that's one of the things that like the Egyptians revered was the Apis bull, and it's like, and they worship the sun, the Apis bull, and you see all that like written in these texts, and like, but you know, now it kind of makes sense. It's like almost like a it's interesting. It's interesting to say the least. You know what I mean? Like what this is all saying and what it means. Because like I said, this Hierosolima, this right here is like the root word for like Jerusalem, or like Jeru, or Yero, which is, like I said, I think it's a moon god. I'm almost certain it's like a moon god. And it's interesting how they're like worshiping the moon god, and then you have like what is it called, like the sun god being worshipped in like Egypt and stuff like that, which is really hard to like paint a good picture on it. And these books kind of give you like some ideas, but it's still like really confusing. But one thing's for sure, like I said, is like Shepherd Kings, Exodus, and then Trojan War. But I don't know why I put so much emphasis on the Trojan War. I feel like it's like really important for like later on. I don't know, something's telling me. I'm getting like a hunch to like hold on to that idea. So of the Exodus, and this is from Polemo. Some of the Greeks also relate that Moses flourished in those times. Polemo, in the first book of his Grecian history, says that in the reign of Apis, the son of Pheroneus, a part of the Egyptian army deserted from Egypt and took up their habitation in that part of Syria which is called Palestine, not far from Arabia. These indeed were they who went out with Moses. Man, I am not reading this book at a good time. This is not the time to be reading all this stuff, honestly. Okay, so this is the Exodus from Ptolemaeus Mendacius. A Moses, who lived about the same time as Annotation and Argive, overthrew the city of Varus, as Ptolemaeus Mendacius has related in his chronicles. Okay, well, I think this is referring to like a later time when they finally expelled all the unclean peoples or whatever, that whole battalion. What is it? Rebels or whatever? I don't know. Okay, so this one's of the exodus of the Jews from Artabanus, and they borrowed of the Egyptians many vessels and no small quantity of raiment and every variety of treasure, and passed over the branches of the river towards Arabia, and upon the 3rd day's march arrived at a convenient station upon the Red Sea. And the Memphites say that... Okay, hold on, let me read this footer real quick. Artabanus, evidently an Alexandrian Jew, is said to have written about a century BC. The fragments of his history which have been preserved follow the scripture of some few variations and additions. I have inserted the above fragment on account of the Memphite and Heliopian traditions of the Exodus referred to in it. Its authenticity, however, is very much to be suspected. Okay. So this is just kind of like, he like really points out like we should be considering in the context of this stuff. So, and the Memphites say that Moses, being well acquainted with that part of the country, waited for the ebbing of the tide, and then made the whole multitude pass through the shallows of the sea. Okay, so this book is not saying it's like they parted the Red Sea, it's just saying they took advantage of the tides. Which is interesting, but I mean, that still doesn't, I don't know, it still really doesn't say all too much, honestly. I don't know whether to believe they really parted the Red Sea or not, but yeah. As much as I like to speculate, I can't really say whether that really happened or not. Same thing with like the whole like destroying the walls of Jericho, but that kind of has a more scientific explanation with like using, you know, the Ark of the Covenant with like humming and doing like this like vibrational amplification focuser beam type of thing going on. But in any case, just continue. But the Heliopolitans say that the king pursued them with great power and took with them the sacred animals in order to recover the substance which the Jews had borrowed from the Egyptians, but that a divine voice instructed Moses to strike the sea with his rod, and that when Moses heard this, he touched the waters with the rod, whereupon the waves stood apart, and the host went through along the dry path. He says, moreover, that when the Egyptians came up with them and followed after them, the fire flashed on them from before, and the sea again inundated the path, and that all the Egyptians perished either by fire or by the return of the waters. But the Jews escaped the danger and passed 30 years in the desert, where God rained upon them a kind of grain like that called panic, whose color was like snow. Okay, so this is like the word, the manna that's mentioned in that. He says also that Moses was ruddy with white. Does not here resume his extract from the narrative of Artabanus? Okay, well, he also says that Moses was ruddy with white hair and of a dignified deportment, and that when he did these things, he was in the 89th year of his age. Dang. Wow. And that concludes whatever fragments we're looking at. I guess it's just like the fragments of the Exodus, I guess. But that concludes that, and we'll follow these next, annals, which are the Tyrian annals, which actually I'm very curious to know about all this stuff, honestly. The fragments of the Tyrian annals from Dias and Menander. Before we leave off on this next part, I do want to kind of like mention that the Empire of Tyre one of the kings, like Hiram, is, yeah, see, like, like one of these, this king's like, for some reason this king's associated with like Freemasonry and like those secret orders and stuff like that. I don't really know why or what that means, but maybe this book will go into detail about all that strangeness. But this is a really important like empire, honestly. Many of which like don't really like consider it, but there's very strangeness to it. So we'll start from the top here in the next video for sure.